My text is titled Optimist of the Future, Past Perfect, and I would like to start it with a quotation from earlier text by Leo Trotsky that was written in 1901 with the title on Optimism and Pessimism on the 20th century and on many other issues. Death to utopia, death to faith, death to love, death to hope. Thunders the 20th century is salvos of fire and in the rumbling of guns. Surrender, you pathetic dreamer. Here I am, your long-awaited 20th century, your future. No, replies the unhumbled optimist. You are only the present. In his short essay, Trotsky gives a brief, unscientific, as he puts it, classification of optimists and pessimists in relation to the past, the present, and the future. The revolutionary castigates the optimist of the past and the optimist of the present as helpless, nostalgic grumblers, and self-righteous Philistines, respectively. According to Trotsky, only a pessimist of the present who is optimistic about the future is worth talking about. The past is interesting to him only as long as it has to do with the unsatisfactory state of affairs in the present. In Trotsky's description of the optimist of the future, we are possibly dealing with the revolutionary and, in general, with the Marxist view of the world in relation to the time vector. The world is historical, and so is its assessment, which largely depends on how successful the practice of its optimization is. Interestingly, despite the fact that in his text written in 1901, Trotsky describes certain catastrophes, he does not concede to the idea of pessimist of the future. At the time, the possibility of catastrophe or collapse on the global scale was not regarded as something relevant or desirable for a revolutionary. But more than 100 years later, it is the pessimist of the future who is becoming one of the main vehicles of hope for the change and optimization of the world in accordance with its original optimum shape. An eloquent testimony of this is the very popularity of the aphorism usually attributed to Jameson and then Zizek. It is easier for us today to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. But at the same time, popularity of this aphorism not reveals the weakness of the liberation movement and the lack of optimistic vision of the future. The idea of apocalypse as deliverance, as a paradoxically optimistic solution to the current problems, speaks volumes of the ontologization of the injustices inherent to capitalist relations. It is nearly impossible to conceive of the fact that capitalism has both a starting point and its end, the point of transformation when it is going to morph into a different system of relations. In other words, it appears to be a totally natural state of things, deeply rooted in the nature of the world. And if humans are not capable of carrying out a social revolution on the global scale, should we expect of them a revolution with respect to the essence of this world? A pessimistic outlook on the possibility of such radical transformations has become a commonplace. The daredevils who challenge this pessimism and argue that social injustice can and should be corrected and remedied are only few. Even more surprisingly, just when Marxism put forward its own solution to the question of optimism, yet another kind of optimism took root, the optimism of the Russian cosmists that focused on the future past perfect, that was meant to bring back, revive, and transform the past in the future. The question of optimism has to do with more than the psychological or other kind of assessment of the world. Rather, it has everything to do with the possibility of congruence or accordance, as well as with the existence of the best possible state of being that define a particular phenomenon. Capitalism replaces the optimal state with infinity, above all with the infinity of growth and the accumulation of capital. At the same time, it is precisely the non-optimal state of the here and now, the bad infinity of the present, that is declared to be the optimal state. Hand in hand with the Christian Reformation, capitalism destabilizes, unlocks the familiar finiteness, circularity, and rigidity of feudal hierarchies. Along with the process of economic coercion that wrenches people away of the familiar pace of life in the familiar setting and offers new definition of things and phenomena, the process of immanentization of the outwardly eternity of life beings. Thanks to the Reformation, God gradually migrates to earth, a relocation that makes him more accessible, comprehensible, and logical. The process of divine transactions is intensified accordingly. In place of the delayed gratification that righteousness used to earn believers in the afterlife, now one can be remunerated for one's virtuous deeds in the here and now, or alternatively penalized for failing to conform with the entrepreneurial spirit of the day. Previously, the Christian absolute understood as endless infinite being was located in the afterlife, in the world to come. It was a delayed eternity, which did, however, determine life in the here and now. But under capitalism, people consider God as a kind of current actual state of affairs that comes to absorb, incorporate the future, and to engender the unending life of the presentness. The laws governing gut reactions slowly transpire and take the form of justice and naturalness of economic coercion. The injustice and evil are in turn personified in the human element, which is not always able to act consciously vis-à-vis the logic of the optimal organization of the world. This is when absolute optimism is born. It is also the time when the best possible world emerges, the one philosophically described by Leibniz and critically glorified in Voltaire's Candide. From the age of exploration onward, circumnavigation of the global spatially duplicates the eternity of the present time. From that moment on, the surface of the Earth has no boundaries. Yet at the same time, it turns out to be a closed-loop infinity. The universe, meanwhile, is still boundless. But this is rather a question of how precise and detailed our knowledge of it is, and the question of comparing different scales of things. The subsequent development of science will limit the infinity of the universe, circumscribe it as Marxist project, circumscribe the development of the production under capitalism by its contradictions. But until then, the scientific revolution associated with the transition from geocentric and focused on internal resources to a heliocentric, outwardly directed system justified as one of its consequences the emergence of infinity in the here and now. Although this infinity is relocated from Earth to a set of galactic clusters, the view of the world that suggested a need delineation between the lower and upper parts, and that implied an outward movement is now being shattered. Now our planet is one of the endless dependent planets which revolve eternally around the energy hubs of their solar systems, forever drawing closer or pulling away from them. And if these planets could speak, the stories they could have told would not have been much different from the narratives of peasants who alternate agricultural labor with periodic migrations to the city for work. You gotta move, or in Russian, go round and round if you wanna survive. It's how people were saying in Russia in 1990s, the era of so-called wild capitalism. Perhaps they subconsciously echoing Galileo Galilei famous "albeit it moves." It is well known that God's return to Earth followed by his dissolution, and as one may possibly add, dissolution in the invisible hand of the market, and in general, this dissolution in the forces that determine the production of life, and then this gradually led to God death. The link with the infinity of the afterlife promised by Christianity, of life after death, eternal and everlasting, whose very existence used to determine the present, is now broken. And this broke down also determines the inner links connecting things to themselves. The arrival of the endless here and now liberates us from the closedness of being, but it does so by expanding the space of coercion and by distorting the promise of eternal life in the future. A similar schism occurs with congruence or accordance. On the one hand, capitalism does not let things to be tantamount to themselves as they undergo a transformation under the pressure of goods money relationships. On the other hand, it facilitates the quantification and abstraction of the world, which becomes meaningful only within a rigid framework of formal congruences. It cannot be argued that previously life was devoid of a numerical, digital dimension, but now it acquires paramount importance, becoming more and more visible. From the psychological point of view, the quantification of life is perceived as its alienation or estrangement, which complements the destruction inflicted by infinities that swept into the static state of the old world. What was once a living, breathing matter now turns into an assemblage of numbers, not only deprived of authenticity and its own substance, but also renouncing any illusion of submission. Both the divine law promoted by the Church and the secular power alike has always displayed a certain degree of personification and dissidentness in relation to their motives. They were open to dialogue, even if this dialogue was not carried out on equal footing. Their actions were open to interpretation and thus grasped, enabling one to find the proper place in the mutual relationship. However, numbers per se are cynical. They do not prevaricate in the relationship built on submission. They leave no room for ambiguity. They defy any attempt at psycholizing their motives. Quantification clearly tells us that what we deal with here has nothing to do with either personal greed or the ill streak in the character of your boss. It is not a matter of God's wrath embodied by Inquisition, but a simpler and trivial matter of math, a relationship built on conclusion, nothing personal, just business, as accountants say. An attempt to escape this banalization of the world leads to fascism that personifies numerical coercion by projecting it on racial differences and seeks to overcome the trauma of infiniteness through the return to the pure state of finiteness, of the primordial authenticity. Today's religious fundamentalist organizations function with the variation of the same logic, but in place of personification, they sacralize the numerical reality, returning responsibility for this reality to God. The Marxist project seeks neither to humanize nor to deify numbers. Furthermore, it advocates real infinity and exposes false conception of infinity understood as a limit to development embodied by capitalism itself. It is well known that sooner or later the development of the forces of production is bound to clash with the system of labor relations. So in order to develop any further, they would have to be transformed through revolution. The abolition of this limit to development must establish proletariat dictatorship, which in turn rationalize and optimize the production process, reactivating infinity growth. Thus, communist rationalization and optimization must complete the process of quantifying the world unleashed by capitalism, transforming it from a process in itself into a process for itself. Total grasp of the world in the number must overcome alienation and return things to themselves, while retaining their digital essence, yet by equalizing the digital essence with the corporeal. Nikolai Chernyshevsky, one of the key figures in the formation of the Russian liberation movement, described the transition from capitalism to socialism by referring to the theory of rational egoism. According to Chernyshevsky, both social types of organization are based on the primacy of egoism, which is an innate human quality. However, at some point, any individual development seeking to obtain greater satisfaction of the person's needs is bound to come face to face with the needs and desires of others that have to be taken into account. In other words, sooner or later, human egoism is bound to find itself in the situation that is known in game theory as a prisoner's dilemma. Ignoring the urgency to take other people's needs into account leads to paradoxical unselfishness, and cooperation yield better results and better serve selfish purposes than the stubborn desire to pursue one's selfish goals alone that leads to failure. According to Marx, capitalism does not hold infinity as a limit. The promise on which it never delivers turns out to be a self-deception. In order to achieve an unlimited growth, capitalism needs to go beyond its confines and morph into communism. Ignoring this fact leads to absolute optimism, ridiculed by Voltaire and Trotsky, that always leaves room for evil and imperfection. Capitalist infinity paradoxically localizes. The death of God, instead of making everything possible, as shown in Dostoevsky novels, makes everything impossible, as illustrated by Lacanian theory. Whereas previously it seemed that God was necessary to keep order, to keep things as they were, and after his death things should be liberated from their confines. Now it's obvious that things are held back due to the logic of capitalist relations, and things are things only because their meaning is assigned to it within the logic of community money relations. The ultimate infinity is an abstract possibility that is never realized because of the lack of money. And in this sense, the false infinity of endless building normal capitalism that governs the life of many post-Soviet countries is a very characteristic phenomenon. If we go back to Trotsky classification now, We can say that the Marxist approach calls for critical pessimism with regard to the optimism of the eternal present. It also calls for critical pessimism vis-à-vis optimism about the future, which is supposed to supplant false transitory hopes for a true and lasting presence in the boundless. Intuitively, one can guess that by extending the present into the future and by transforming capitalism in itself into a dialectical opposition, communism or egoism for itself, we do not gain access to absolute growth. Rather, this transformation subjugates them to the dictate of the present on some higher level. Examples drawn from history seem to confirm this assumption. Was not the Bolshevik party an optimistic party here and now? A party of brilliant tacticians, not strategists, chess players, but not the lovers of Go game. In other words, members of the party were the people who, just like most of the representatives of progressive forces of their own time, could only rarely afford to appeal to something beyond the already given state of affairs. But because of that, they were lucky enough to be able to organize revolution, of course. But unfortunately, the post-1917 history of RSDRP and the communistic project is a history of a race in the present, a record of endless attempts to catch up with the even elusive capitalist limit. It is not a record of the first ever successful attempt to venture into the open space of the infinity. Another solution to the problem of the unfulfilled promise of the infinity by capitalism can be found in the philosophy of Russian Cosmism. It was born around the same period as the nascent Marxist project. Both doctrines have a lot in common in their intentions toward humanity, for example, restoration of justice, first of all, and in relation to things. But it's also possible to compare Marxism and Cosmism as two examples of anti-philosophy, which seeks, first of all, not to build an integrated intellectual system, but above all else to organize the practical aspects of life by engaging into intellectual clarification of the current state of affairs. However, the two doctrines differ in the kinds of solutions that they suggest. One proposes a communist return of the infinity of growth through the rationalization and intensification of production, that is, acceleration of progress. The other one also offers rationalization, but it's kind of rationalization, but not with the goal of achieving even greater growth than that was possible under capitalism, or continuing unlimited development, but rather for the sake of stopping this development once and for all the moment humans succeed in mastering time. Cosmists regard progress not as a goal or an end in itself, but rather as a necessary sacrifice that is an integral part of humanity's struggle to survive and evolve. Real development, they believe, can only begin after humanity triumphs over death and learns how to resurrect the dead. This vision suggests that the future becomes a reconstruction or restoration of the past, and the arrow of time bites its own tail. Cosmism offers a gateway, a means to break free and out of this capitalistic ray that undermines from within the eternal present of optimization of the here and now. In a sense, the possibility of mastering time insists on rationalizing communist rationalization, since the latter limits its intentions to adjusting the success of the development process. But the process itself is accepted as a given, as an axiom that is not subject to rationalization. In other words, under communism, the optimization of the eternal present, despite the return of accordance of things to themselves and the infinity of growth, do not become fully realized, do not become an optimization for themselves. Few thinkers have attempted to analyze the similarity between those two projects, communism and Cosmism. There is one interesting example from Marxist side that I would mention. This is Bolsheviks fraction of God builders, headed by Bogdanov, Lunacharsky, and Maxim Gorky. For example, already after the revolution, with support of Lunacharsky, biologist and neo-Lamarckist Paul Kammer was invited to visit the USSR. Kammer studied the possibility of inheriting obtained features of the organism known to be excluded from Darwin's theory, evolutionary theory. He also experimented with the prolongation of life. The scientist believed that there is no such thing as a natural death, because death is always violent, because our nature itself could act sometime as a killer. Both aspects of Kammer's scientific research could be extremely useful for the young proletarian state, keen on engineering a new human being immortal and imbibed with the high culture necessary for living in communist society. The Institute of Blood Transfusion, directed by Bogdanov, puts forward its own solution towards the achievement of the same goals. Unity of people in the classless society, society without racial, sexual, or age restrictions, and with the possibility of radical extension of lifetime. These were the necessary Cosmist addition to the Bolshevik Marxism proposed from within the party itself. But among followers of Fyodorov's philosophy, there were attempts to consciously interact with Bolshevism as well. And they include the post-revolutionary activities of the representative of Russian religious philosophy, Valerian Muravyev. The thinker is mainly known for his only lifetime publication, Mastering of Time, written during his short-lived work at the Central Institute of Labor, institution which was created by prolet cult poet Gastev for the purpose of producing scientific organization of the labor process and its subsequent rational optimization. The cosmic thinker developed his colleagues' intuitions, but gives them a universal scale, combines a theory of counter sets, Bergson duration philosophy, and some conclusions from Einstein's theory of relativity. Muravyev proposes a project of ultimate time optimization that can be understood as an increasing compression or condensation of life organization. So, under capitalism, there is a plant developed, the first derivative of time. Communism involves the acceleration of plant development, the second derivative of time. Muravyev's Cosmist project depicts the prospect of further acceleration up to the possible limit of our universe, the third and further derivatives of time. To achieve this goal, Muravyev suggested the final quantification of the world and the development of universal productive mathematics that should be used for managing it. If one attempts to describe the process of mastery of time, it might be like extending the principle of the scientific organization labor not only to human activity, but to all being as a whole. This process could be called ontologization of time management, or the time management of life, because for Muravyev, time is an expression of its change. As examples proven even a partial possibility of realization of the conceived, the thinker appealed to our opportunity to use the reversibility of chemical reactions, as well as the skillful action of the proletariat, which makes the work faster than it should be done. That is, the mastery of time is understood as conscious management aimed to increasing the complicity organization of life as opposed to degradation and chaos. With the communist rationalization of the production process, which takes the first steps in the intended perspective, it was not possible to achieve the set goals for Muravyov. Therefore, it is not surprising that philosopher got his position at the Central Institute of Labor with the help of one of the Bolsheviks, Leo Trotsky. Subsequently, including through contact with the ally of Lenin, the Cosmist thinker was arrested and soon dead in Siberian labor camps. Meanwhile, the connection between the Cosmist and Bolshevik began in 1921, when the Cosmist realized the significance of the transformation initiated by the communists and wrote a letter to Trotsky. This text, preserved in the archives of the FSB, former KGB, enables us to better understand the potential logic of combining Marxism and Cosmism from the point of view of the latter. Yes, writes Muravyov, the political victory of the Soviet government is complete, but this is not what is necessary, so that one can talk about building in that large scale. To do this, it is necessary that the whole subsoil of life should be changed, so that in fact there will be a profound revolution in all relationship, all perception, all modes of life. While I see kind of an army around me, ready for a battle, but standing still, it is necessary to see it's in a battle. While I see a skillful created mechanism, it's necessary for it to start its own life, turned into an organism. Then one might say whether it was born in for real or not, whether it is a reality or it's only an illusion. End of quotation. And if so, according to Muravyov, then the optimist of the future in Trotsky classification is only an improved version of the self-satisfied inhabitant of the eternal present. Only an optimist of the future past perfect can complete the mission of the human species to transform the capitalist universe and enter the space of infinite cosmic life. The infinity of development promised by capitalism and embodied in its Marxist rationalization needs the next step. That's why Muravyov speaks about Cosmists. We are more Bolsheviks than Bolsheviks themselves, and then he explains, the revolution is not revolutionary enough for us. It is too close in public tasks, whereas we would like the world cosmic revolution. Thank you.